Embroidery is an art that is practiced all over the world, and as so, it has a very long and interesting history. According to the Encyclopedia of Britannica, its origin stems from China, and early embroidery can be traced back down to 30,000 BC. As mentioned by the article The History of Embroidery by Say It With Stitches, later on in the medieval Islamic world, embroidery was a sign of high social status in Muslim societies and could be found on many items such as handkerchiefs, flags, uniforms, horse drapings, pouches, and etc. Then, in the 18th century in England and its colonies, embroidery was a skill marking a girl's passage into womanhood as well as conveying rank and social standing. Even Jane Austen, who's widely known for her literature such as Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, was an embroiderer. And although, as mentioned by Julie's book article, Jane Austen's Templar is in a private collection and cannot be seen, but her sister's Cassandra Austen's Templar can be seen in the Jane Austen House Museum. Soon after the 18th and 19th century, the development of the embroidery machine and mass production came about in the stages of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1900s, patterns, papers, along with the production of cheaper materials like thread and fabric, helped make embroidery more widespread and economical. Today, most embroidery can be seen on clothing and stores is done by machines, which has also further continued to make embroidery more accessible. Today, I will show you guys how to embroider by hand, and I hope this continues to preserve the craft. Okay, so now that we're beginning to embroider, the first step is that we want to gather all of our supplies. According to the Autodesk Instructables, the main materials you're going to need is an embroidery hoop, fabric, a needle, as well as some embroidery thread, some scissors, as well as a pen, and optional could be some beads. You can embroider in some beads as well if you want to enhance your design. One important thing to note when starting off is that you want to make sure that your fabric is larger than your hoop. This right here is folded, so it looks smaller, but it is larger than the hoop itself. The next thing that we want to do after we gathered our materials is to prep our materials. This is going to be first done with the fabric and the hoop. First, we're going to unscrew the hoop. Once our hoop has been unscrewed, we can go ahead and separate the two pieces and then place our fabric in between the hoops. Once our fabric is settled in, we can then place the second hoop on top and then screw it in place. Once the fabric is screwed in, we want to make sure that there's tension in the fabric, and we do this by pulling on the excess fabric around it to ensure that the more tension there is within the fabric, the easier it is to embroider later on. Once you ensure that there's tension in the fabric, we can then cut around the excess fabric to make it easier to handle. Ready? The next thing we need to prep is our needle and thread, which of course we prep by threading the needle. For right now, I will be threading my needle with this green colored thread. Okay, so one thing worth noting is that regular embroidery floss comes in 6 strands. So I don't know if you can see, but they have 6 strands of thread. And when you are beginning, or when you're embroidering, you might not always want to have your thread be as thick. And so usually you separate the threads. I typically embroider with only 3 strands of thread. So that's what I'm going to be doing here now. I'm going to be separating my 3 strands. Okay, so here I have 3 strands on each side, and I just separate it. Okay. And then now I'm going to finally thread it through the needle. Okay, once our thread is threaded through their needle, we need to tie off the ends. It's just a simple knot. Okay, so now we have our fabric and hoop as well as our needle and thread prepped. Now our next step is to draw or put our design onto our fabric. As Autodesk Instructables mentions, washable pens are best if you're drawing on your design directly, but any regular pen works, and I will be using just a pen, a red pen. So as you can see, I've drawn my design on, which may not look like much now, but they're supposed to be strawberries and vines. So now our next step is to start actually stitching. When you're first stitching, when you first make your stitch, you want to make sure that you start by putting the needle through the back and not from the front. This will ensure that the ends, the excess, like tied off ends from where we've tied our knot, will remain at the back rather than at the front. So I'm going to start our first stitch, starting at the vine over here, starting from the back, poking through, and then pulling the thread completely through. Now when it comes to actually embroidering and stitching, there are many different types of techniques that can be used. During the Regency era, samplers were quite popular, and as expressed by Julie Buck, a sampler is an example or a sample of stitching of either patterns or techniques. These were used to practice different techniques and when learning how to embroider, as well as a sheet of reference. For simplicity today, I'm just going to be mostly just using a split stitch, or sometimes as well as a chain stitch sometimes. And then for filling in the gaps, I'm going to be using a satin stitch. So start off, I'm going to be using a chain stitch for doing the vines as well as the leaves. So for that, you're going to want, so after you initially pull your thread through, you're going to put it back following your guide and thread it, but this time not completely through, just mostly. And then before you completely thread it, you're gonna thread back in the middle of the first 2 stitches and then through the loop that you just created, and then finally pull through completely. Okay, and then that's your first stitch. And then if you were to flip it over, you can see that the excess fabric is at the back, which is why we started the stitching from the back first, to ensure that this extra thread would remain here at the back rather than at the front where our design will be. So now we just want to continue doing those chain stitches all around your design, which again, you just pull the needle through up, down, following your design. And then if we're completely pulling through the thread, up again through the middle, and then finally pulling through. And then with that, I'm going to continue doing that until I get up to the leaves. And then now that I finished doing the outline of the strawberries, I'm going to tie off the ends like before in the back. But now I'm going to use a satin stitch to fill in the strawberries as well as the leaves, which will look with the satin stitch. what I'll be doing is I'm going to pull the needle through the top. And then just pull it down at the very end of the outline. And then just keep on doing that until the whole shape gets filled in. Okay, so now that I finished embroidering while using the satin stitch for both the leaves and the strawberries, now I'm going to finish by adding the little seeds of the strawberries. And I'm going to be using these small beads as the seeds. So in order to use these small beads, I need to use a needle that is small enough that fits through the bead. So I'm going to be using just regular thread rather than the embroidering floss because it's also too thick for the beads to fit through. So okay, so once I finished threading my needle, I put the needle in through the back. And now to actually start embroidering in the beads, I'm gonna grab the needle and then grab a bead and then insert the bead through the needle as so, and then finish threading it through the string as well, through the thread. So we have that. And then I'm just going to put the needle back through the fabric and pull through the thread. And then there we have a bead. And then with these beads, I'm going to use them to represent the seeds of the strawberry. So I'm just going to scatter them around the strawberries, and yeah. So after I finish putting all the beads, I just simply cut off the excess strand and tied off the thread. Now we're left with this. And okay, so since now I'm actually done with the actual embroidery, if this were an article of clothing, I would just remove the hoop and just, enjoy the embroidery. But since I'm gonna be leaving it on the hoop, I'm gonna leave the embroidery and fabric in the hoop. I'm gonna show you how I just tie off the ends and just make everything look neater. So first thing, I just thread my needle with some embroidering floss, and then I turn it over at the back, and I do a running stitch. So with a running stitch, I'm just going to go through the fabric, just in, and then just a few centimeters over to the left, and then just come back right out, and then just keep on doing that throughout the entire circumference of the circle. Now that I've done that all around the circumference of the circle, I'm going to now further gather the fabric. Here is where I've left off, and I'm gonna go back into the fabric, and then so I'm basically just gonna gather it all together here. So I'm just gonna gather the fabric and then just do, I guess, another running stitch through that. So now that I finished doing that all around the circumference of the circle again, I'm now gonna cut off the excess and then tie a knot like always. Okay, and with that I am finished with this embroidery project. Today I showed y'all how to embroider with this specific design, but really this can be applied to any design of your liking. The chain stitch can be used for outlining, the satin stitch can be used for filling it in, and then just for like an extra flair you can add, you saw how I added the beads, and you could always do that yourself now as well. And then really you can just embroider anything that comes to mind. So you can also buy fabric that already has printed on designs, and overall it's just, even if you're not the greatest at drawing, this is a really fun craft to do, and a craft that's filled with a lot of history. And overall I hope this really drew your attention to the craft of embroidering. And yeah.